The galaxy was not quiet. It breathed in broken rhythms, as though each fading star coughed its last light into the vastness before surrendering to the black. There were empires once, constellations of power that lit the void with banners and wars, voices that claimed eternity. Now only ruins lingered, scattered like bones in a field long forgotten. Between those grave-marked stars moved something deeper than silence, older than hunger, a shadow that stretched across the skein of the void, and its name was whispered only in dread. Morbidis. The Hive fleet had come, and with it came the unmaking of all things. Yet as we step into this tale of descent and betrayal, know that you are not alone. We who tell this story truly love and care for you. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let us begin. Morbidis moved like a sickness in the dark, unseen yet undeniable. Entire sectors felt the pressure of its presence in their dreams before its claws ever raked across their worlds. Where it passed, suns grew dimmer, as though their fires recoiled from the approach of something that devoured not just matter, but meaning. And upon the eternal throne of Calith, beneath vaults painted with the fading glories of conquest, the immortal ruler stirred. They had no name that remained spoken aloud, for names withered when centuries stacked upon centuries. To their people, they were only the eternal sovereign, a figure carved from shadow and promise, bound by a vow never to die. They had sought that vow in desperation long ago, believing eternity meant control. Now beneath the distant roar of a fleet that blotted out starlight, eternity felt more like chains. The chamber around them was a museum of victories turned to dust. Banners of 1,000 conquests hung limp, colors faded, stitching undone. Hololiths flickered dim, showing campaigns that no longer mattered, triumphs hollow in retrospect. The sovereign looked upon them not with pride, but with the weariness of one who has seen all victories curdle into loss. Immortality had granted them time enough to watch everything they built rot from the inside. And now, as Morbidis swam nearer, a thought uncoiled within. Perhaps the swarm was not their enemy, but the end they had secretly longed for. Yet pride clung to them still, like rust that refuses to be scraped away. Their empire was fractured but not broken. Fleets remained, worlds still bowed, soldiers still raised banners. The Council of Ash whispered behind them, voices that bickered over scraps, commanders with eyes always fixed on knives rather than stars. They spoke of alliances, of oaths sworn with foreign dynasties, of bargains that would preserve some fragment of their dominion. But the sovereign had heard such whispers for centuries. Betrayal was the language of rulers, loyalty a fleeting gesture before knives slid between ribs. They had lived long enough to know that no empire truly falls from without. It is always betrayal within that rots the root. Still, the vision of Morbidis haunted them. In restless nights, they saw it as more than claws and teeth. They saw it as a mirror. Its endless hunger was not so different from their own. Was immortality not its own devouring? A refusal to yield, an eternal consumption of moments until nothing but ash remained. They wondered if the Hive fleet was punishment or reflection, or some deeper truth woven into the fabric of the universe. If so, then their people would not survive it. They themselves might not survive it, though death had long been denied them. And the question burned like acid. Did they even wish to? They moved to the great window of the throne hall, a pane of crystalline armor thicker than a palace wall, and gazed upon the void. Out there, the first edge of Morbidis's shadow brushed against distant suns. Signals came of entire colonies gone silent, fleets swallowed whole without resistance. In that silence, the sovereign imagined the faces of their people, soldiers who would march without question, citizens who still believed in banners that no longer meant anything. Were they betraying them by clinging to pride, by refusing to bend, or would bending be the greater betrayal, the surrender of all that once defined them? A voice stirred behind them, sharp as glass. "My lord, we must flee." The sovereign turned, finding the old Admiral Vanar, eyes sunken, armor dull. "There is no shame in retreat. There is shame only in extinction. We cannot face this tide. Not even gods could." His words hung heavy, but pride recoiled. The sovereign's lips curled into a whisper barely heard. "I have outlived gods before." Yet even as they said it, doubt gnawed, for Morbidis was not a god. It was something worse, something that needed no worship, only flesh. That night, dreams came, unbidden and sharp. They walked among endless corridors of bone, where the walls pulsed as though alive, and voices whispered not in words but in hungers. They felt the tide pressing inward, clawing at the edges of their eternity, as though Morbidis itself sought to unravel the secret of their undying flesh. And in the dream, they saw their heir, standing amidst the swarm, eyes bright, lips smiling as if in welcome. The sovereign woke with a start, and the chamber felt colder than it had in 1,000 years. The first council that followed was bitter. Rivals spoke of pacts, of reaching across to old enemies for aid. One voice spoke of awakening relics buried beneath forgotten stars, engines that should never see light again. And the air, quiet until now, spoke of something darker. Perhaps we do not resist the shadow. Perhaps we embrace it. Gasps filled the chamber, oaths spat, yet the sovereign heard those words echoing with the weight of their dream. Perhaps the air was not entirely wrong. The council dissolved in rage, and the sovereign was left alone once more in their hall of faded banners. They touched the stone of the throne itself, cracked by age, and wondered how long it would take for Morbidis to reduce even this to dust. Pride told them to resist, to raise fleets, to fight until the last world burned. Weariness told them that surrender might be release, the ending immortality had forever denied. But duty whispered too, quiet and bitter. Every soul that still looked to them for salvation would burn or survive based on their choice. Their heart, weighed by centuries, felt heavy as iron. And so the stage was set. Shadows gathered at the edges of the stars. Hungers whispered in the warp, and betrayal simmered within the very blood of their house. The eternal sovereign stood between pride and ruin, immortality and oblivion, their own heir waiting in silence for the moment to choose. And far beyond, Hive fleet Morbidis spread its wings of hunger wide across the dark, as if the galaxy itself were nothing more than a feast waiting to be consumed. The descent had only begun. The sovereign did not sleep again after that dream. Time itself felt brittle, stretched thin as if eternity was beginning to fray around the edges. They had lived through the rise of dynasties and the slow death of gods, had seen the galaxy shift and shatter like glass under tides of war. Yet the image of their heir smiling among the swarm lingered with a weight heavier than any battle fought in centuries. They stood in the solitude of their chambers, where the air itself seemed to press against them like stone. The banners whispered when the currents shifted, carrying echoes of victories long dead, and the sovereign felt the loneliness of immortality settle deep into their marrow. Pride and sorrow clashed within them, for eternity was not meant to be endured alone, and yet all others who had once shared their age had long since succumbed to dust. The arrival of dawn, though artificial on the throne world, cast a pale glow over the crystalline walls. From here, the stars outside appeared faint, their light muted beneath the spreading veil of the Hive fleet. The sovereign's mind drifted back across centuries to the moment they had chosen this path. It had been a time of desperation, when their people faced annihilation at the hands of another ancient enemy. In that desperate hour, immortality had been their salvation, a forbidden covenant sealed with whispers and sacrifices that even now remained unspoken. The memory burned as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. The feel of cold iron across their wrists, the taste of ashes in their mouth, the promises given by voices that had no faces. What they had believed to be a gift had become a prison. Their people saw them as eternal, unshakable. Yet beneath the surface lay a soul that had been stretched too thin, yearning for an end. The chamber doors opened with a hiss, and light footsteps crossed the vast expanse of the hall. It was their heir, the one whose smile in the dream had pierced deeper than any Sir blade. The young figure moved with grace, but there was a sharpness in the eyes, a brilliance that shimmered like glass on the verge of shattering. They bowed with the formality of duty, though it was a gesture filled with tension. "You did not call for me, yet I come," the heir said softly, voice steady, though the sovereign could hear the rebellion that lingered behind the calm. "You dreamt again, did you not?" The sovereign turned away, unwilling to reveal too much. Dreams are nothing more than shadows of the mind. They hold no power here. The words were firm, yet even as they spoke them, they felt the hollow untruth in their chest. The heir's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, not quite mockery. "Perhaps, or perhaps the swarm whispers even to you. Perhaps you are not as untouched as you once believed." Anger flickered, but it was brief, quickly buried beneath the exhaustion that weighed heavier than rage. "Do you come to counsel me, or to test me?" The heir's eyes met theirs, unflinching. "I come to remind you that the people tire. They are loyal, yes, but loyalty cracks under fear. Already whispers grow louder in the lower halls. They say you are too proud to save us, too bound by the arrogance of eternity to bend. They wonder if the eternal throne will become their tomb." The sovereign felt the words strike with the precision of a blade. Pride urged them to silence the insolence, to remind the heir of blood and duty. But instead, they remained still. For in the depth of the words lay truth. The people were afraid, and fear, once seeded, grew quickly, devouring all else. "You speak as though surrender were salvation," the sovereign said at last, voice edged with weariness. "Would you throw open our gates and welcome the swarm inside? Would you kneel to something that cannot be bargained with, cannot be reasoned with, cannot even comprehend what you are?" The heir's gaze hardened, though sorrow flickered there too. "I would not kneel, but I would not cling to a crumbling throne while worlds burn around us. Perhaps survival means more than holding fast to banners of dust. Perhaps it means changing into something we cannot yet imagine." The sovereign turned sharply, stepping closer, their voice low and heavy. "Changing into what? Into them. Into the swarm that devours and forgets. That is not survival. That is erasure." Yet even as the words left their lips, the memory of their dream rose again, the heir standing calmly among the tide of Morbidis, unconsumed, almost welcomed. The thought gnawed at the edges of their certainty. The heir bowed again, though less deeply this time. "Then lead us differently. Prove to them and to me that you are not only a relic of the past. Show us that eternity still has meaning." With that, they turned and departed, leaving the sovereign once more to the silence of their chamber. For long hours, the sovereign remained unmoving. The words echoed, colliding with memories that had long been buried. They recalled the day their first companion had died, centuries ago, long before the empire had fractured. That companion had begged them not to seek the covenant of immortality, had warned that eternity would not bring peace, only loneliness. They had not listened, and now, all these years later, the warning had proven true. Every face they had once cherished was gone. Only the air remained, carrying both the hope of a future and the threat of betrayal. Night came once more, and with it, the voices. The sovereign lay in restless stillness, their eyes closed, yet the swarm pressed against their thoughts like a tide-breaking stone. They heard the faint chittering of countless jaws, felt the psychic weight of hunger unending. Yet beneath it, there was something more, something almost intimate. A whisper, not in sound, but in sensation, like breath upon the soul. You are not eternal. You are already ours. They awoke with a start, sweat cold upon their brow, though their flesh had not needed sleep in centuries. The hall was dark, save for the glow of distant stars fading behind the shadow of Morbidis. They knew then that time was closing around them, that choices would soon demand themselves in blood and fire. The air would not wait forever. The council would not remain united, and Morbidis, endless and patient, would consume all hesitation. The sovereign rose, their body heavy though undying, and walked once more to the great crystalline window. They looked out upon the dark, and for the first time in all the centuries of their reign, they felt something close to fear. Not of death, for death had abandoned them, but of meaninglessness, of being remembered not as savior or ruler, but as the last relic of an empire swallowed whole, standing too proud and too weary to bend. The stars shuddered beyond the glass. The descent of Hive fleet Morbidis was no longer distant rumor. It was here, unfolding, stretching its shadow into the marrow of eternity. And the sovereign, eternal and alone, felt the first crack form deep within the armor of their pride. The Council of Ash gathered beneath the fractured dome of the Grand Conclave, where shadows pressed more heavily than light. The air was thick with incense and the faint metallic tang of old blood, for the hall had been sanctified by countless oaths across centuries, many of which ended in betrayal. The sovereign sat upon the raised throne of black stone at the center, a figure shrouded in layers of silence, their eyes unreadable. Around them circled the councillors, admirals, and lords of the realm, each voice sharp with fear and ambition. Outside the crystalline walls, the stars dimmed beneath the encroaching shadow of Morbidis, though few dared to look directly at it. The chamber hummed with murmurs, each word another thread in the web of intrigue tightening around the Empire's throat. Admiral Vanar spoke first, his voice like gravel breaking stone. The swarm is beyond reckoning. Our outer fleets have already been devoured. We cannot hope to withstand it with what remains. I say we retreat inward, abandon the frontier worlds, and concentrate on fortifying the throne system itself. At least then, we might survive the first strike. His words carried the weight of bitter pragmatism, yet also cowardice, and several councillors hissed their disapproval. Lady Sarath, robed in crimson, leaned forward, her eyes cold as obsidian. You speak of survival, Admiral, yet what you suggest is surrender in all but name. Abandon the frontier, and we abandon the blood of our people. We would hand them to the swarm without even raising a blade. Better to burn our worlds ourselves than to leave them as fodder for that hunger. Her words ignited a flare of approval, yet also sharpened divisions. The councillors were not united, and each speech fractured them further. At the far end of the chamber, Lord Avaris smiled faintly, his lips curled like a blade sheathed but ready. His voice slid into the silence, smooth and dangerous. Why must we carry this burden alone? There are powers beyond our borders who would see the swarm broken as much as we. If we extend the hand of alliance, if we offer them what remains of our fleets, they may take the front lines in our stead. Survival does not always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from the right betrayal at the right time. His words hung heavy, poisonous, and tempting. The sovereign's eyes narrowed, but they did not yet speak. Whispers surged through the chamber. Alliances meant debts. Debts meant chains. Yet chains might be preferable to being devoured. The councillors knew it, even as they spat curses at the idea. Fear was already reshaping their loyalties. It was then the heir stepped forward, their presence commanding, though their youth burned like a flame among embers. You squabble like carrion birds over bones while the sky itself darkens above us. You speak of retreat, of surrender, of bargaining with old enemies. All of it reeks of desperation. Perhaps the truth is simpler. Their voice, steady and clear, carried across the chamber. Perhaps we cannot destroy the swarm, because the swarm is not an enemy to be destroyed. Perhaps it is the next stage, the inevitable tide. To resist it may be folly. To embrace it may be survival. The chamber erupted. Shouts crashed like thunder against the walls. Accusations of heresy and madness tore through the air. Some cried for silence, others for blood. The sovereign rose at last, and with their rising, silence fell. The weight of their presence alone stilled the room, though their voice, when it came, was colder than the void. You speak with dangerous ease, my blood. Be careful what shadows you embrace. The swarm does not ally, it does not reason, it does not forgive, it devours. To embrace it is to cease to be. Yet the air did not falter. Their gaze held steady, bright and unwavering. And what are we now, if not already ceasing to be? Our empire is ash. Our fleets crumble. Our people whisper of betrayal. Eternity binds you, sovereign, but for us, the living, there is no eternity. There is only the choice between death and change. I do not say kneel. I say perhaps there is a way to endure by becoming something more than what we are. The sovereign's hand clenched against the arm of their throne. To silence the air would have been easy. To declare them traitor, even easier. But within the sovereign's heart, a tremor of unease stirred. The dream, the vision of their heir among the swarm, echoed now with cruel resonance. Was it foresight, or poison seeded in their thoughts by the shadow pressing through the warp? They could not know. Yet the words of the heir had already taken root in the minds of others. Seeds of doubt scattered across the chamber, and even those who spat curses could not entirely hide the flicker of consideration in their eyes. The sovereign broke the silence with a voice sharp as a blade. Enough. The swarm is no savior. It is an ending, and I will not see this council fracture into worshippers of annihilation. We will hold. We will fight. We will endure. Let those who speak of surrender or embrace remember their oaths or be cast out into the dark. There was no applause, no roar of loyalty, only silence heavy with tension. The council dispersed with whispers sharper than knives, each lord and admiral leaving with new schemes burning in their minds. None would speak openly of rebellion yet, but the thought had been planted. The sovereigns saw it in their eyes. The heir had given voice to what many secretly feared, and in doing so had shifted the path of destiny. When the chamber finally emptied, the sovereign remained alone, the hall echoing with the memory of shouted voices. They felt the weight of eternity pressing upon them, heavier than it had ever been. Betrayal had always been the companion of rulers, but now it slithered closer than ever, wearing the face of their own blood. They could not decide if it was defiance or prophecy. The line between the two blurred as the shadow of Morbidis crept deeper across the stars. Outside, the void shivered. The first true vanguard of the Hive fleet had arrived at the edge of the system, vast as mountains, their forms moving like living planets across the dark. The swarm had come not for parley, not for treaties, but for flesh and memory. Already, worlds whispered of silence where once there had been light. The sovereign gazed upon the approaching tide and wondered if the council's divisions had already doomed them all. In that moment, the thought struck like a blade. Perhaps the air was right. Perhaps eternity meant nothing in the face of hunger without end. And yet, pride held firm, fragile though it was. They would not bow. Not yet. The chamber lights dimmed, and shadows deepened as the sovereign whispered to themselves. Words no one else would, Sarah, hear. If betrayal is to come, let it come from within. I will meet it as I have met every tide, alone, unyielding, eternal. But even as they spoke it, a fissure opened in their heart, and the silence of the swarm pressed closer, as though listening, as though waiting. The night stretched long upon the throne world, though the stars offered little light through the canopy of shadow spreading across the heavens. Within the sovereign's chambers, silence pressed in heavy waves, disturbed only by the faint whisper of the air systems cycling through ancient stone. Yet their mind was not still. When they closed their eyes, the dark was no longer empty. Shapes writhed there, vast and unknowable, a tide of forms that shifted between flesh and dream. The swarm whispered, not with voices, but with hunger, and in its hunger was something more, a recognition, a reflection. The sovereign felt their immortality stir uneasily, as if Morbidis itself sought to unravel it, strand by strand, to consume even the eternity they had thought untouchable. The first vision came as they drifted into a half-sleep. They stood in the ruins of their own throne room, banners torn and aflame, the stone cracked and bleeding with roots of alien flesh. Around them, the councillors lay torn apart, their faces unrecognizable, their ambitions devoured. Only one figure remained whole, the heir, standing amidst the devastation, untouched by tooth or claw. Their eyes burned with strange light, not the warmth of humanity, but something older, colder, as though the swarm itself had chosen them. When the sovereign reached to touch them, the vision dissolved, leaving behind only the echo of that smile they had already seen in dreams. They woke with a sharp breath, hands clutching at the arm of their throne as though to anchor themselves in reality. Yet the whisper lingered in their mind, tugging, weaving, suggesting. It was not command, not compulsion, but invitation. The swarm did not need to speak to entice. It was hunger made manifest, and hunger was something every soul understood. Still, the sovereign clung to their pride, whispering to themselves like a prayer, I am eternal. I am not yours. Yet even in that whisper, doubt gnawed. When dawn came, the air entered once more, unbidden, as though summoned by unseen currents. Their eyes carried no sleep, only a strange brightness, a defiance wrapped in calm. You are weary, they said, almost softly, almost with pity. The council tears itself apart, and the swarm grows closer. Do you still believe eternity alone can save us? The sovereign looked upon them with a weariness carved deeper than stone. What do you believe, child? That we surrender ourselves to the swarm, that we step willingly into its maw, hoping to be remade? The words were sharp, but their voice trembled with something unspoken, something close to fear. The air did not flinch. I believe survival demands change. We are bound by an empire that no longer exists, by symbols that no longer matter. The people know this. They whisper in corners that you will let them die rather than yield. If they turn to me, it will not be because I betrayed you. It will be because they believe you betrayed them first. The sovereign's gaze darkened, a storm gathering in the hollows of their immortal eyes. Yet beneath it lay sorrow. You speak as though you already see yourself upon the throne. The heir's lips curved slightly, not in arrogance, but in inevitability. I speak as one who has heard the whispers, as you have. They reach me as well. In dreams, in thoughts not my own. Do you not feel it? The swarm does not only devour, it offers. It shows us what we might become if we cast aside what chains us. The sovereign's hand trembled against the stone of the throne. The words mirrored too closely what they had felt in the night, what they had seen in the vision. The swarm had reached them both. Perhaps it reached everyone in time. They turned away, unable to meet the heir's gaze, for in their eyes shone the reflection of something they had long feared, the possibility that their own blood might welcome the end more than resist it. The chamber door opened then, admitting Admiral Vaynar with a hurried bow. His voice was low, urgent, carrying the strain of battle already lost. My sovereign, the first wave has entered the outer reaches of the system. Duskfall burns. The fleets stationed there are gone. The swarm does not pause, does not break. It moves as if it knows our every weakness. His face was pale beneath the weight of failure. We must decide now. Do we fall back to the throne, or scatter what remains of our fleets to harry them in vain? The sovereign rose slowly, their presence filling the chamber, though inside they felt hollow. We will not scatter. We will not flee. We will stand as we have always stood. This throne has weathered centuries. It will weather this. The words rang with conviction, but within, a quiet voice whispered of lies. They had weathered much, yes, but nothing like this. The heir's gaze burned hotter. And if you lead us only into death, if standing means only being devoured while you cling to pride. The sovereign's hand struck the throne, the sound echoing like thunder. Better death in defiance than life in submission. Yet even as the words roared from their lips, the hunger stirred again in the marrow of their bones, whispering that submission was not death, but transformation. That perhaps eternity could be reforged into something greater than pride, something endless and new. When the chamber emptied, leaving only silence, the sovereign sank once more into solitude. The banners above them stirred in unseen winds, the ghosts of centuries brushing against the present. They closed their eyes and let the visions come, no longer able to keep them at bay. This time they saw not the air, but themselves kneeling upon a field of bone, their immortal flesh cracking, their eternity bleeding into the soil. The swarms surrounded them, endless and magnificent, but it did not devour. Instead, it consumed the fragments of their pride, stripping them bare until only hunger remained. And in that hunger, they felt no fear, no loneliness, no betrayal, only belonging. For the first time in centuries, belonging. They woke with a cry, their voice echoing through the chamber. Sweat slicked their brow, though they had not needed fleshly rest in ages. The window before them glowed faint with the light of dying stars, the shadow of Morbidis stretching closer. They pressed a hand to the glass, as if to feel the void itself. "Am I yours already?" they whispered, and for the briefest moment, in the silence that followed, They thought they heard the answer. Not in words, not in sound, but in the deep pull of inevitability that swam like a tide beneath their eternity. It was not yet victory for the swarm, but it was no longer defiance either. It was the beginning of surrender. The sovereign turned away from the stars, their steps echoing across the empty hall. The council would not hear of this. The air must not see this doubt. Yet in their heart, they carried the whisper of belonging, and it grew heavier with every breath. And above the throne world, the shadow spread wider, cloaking heaven itself in the endless descent of Hive fleet Morbidis. The pact of forgotten stars was not spoken of in open halls. It was whispered in vaults sealed by iron and blood, where the last flames of the empire's pride guttered in the stale air. The sovereign descended into those hidden chambers beneath the eternal throne, where the walls bore carvings so ancient that even they, with centuries of memory, could not recall their first etching. Here, the old dynasties had once pledged unity before conquest scattered them into rival courts. Now those same dynasties sent emissaries cloaked in secrecy, their banners hidden, their blades sharper than their smiles. They came not out of loyalty, but because hunger pressed at their borders, and silence had replaced the voices of their colonies. The swarm had stripped away all pretense. Survival alone had called them here. The sovereign entered the chamber, cloaked in shadows, their presence as heavy as the stone that loomed above. They saw the others gathered around the black table, carved from the wreck of a starship that had fallen in a war no one remembered. Lord Avaris sat with his usual serpent smile, fingers tapping a rhythm that spoke of calculations already made. Lady Saratha's eyes blazed like coals, her crimson robes stiff with the weight of ritual. Behind them hovered attendants, silent and watchful, each one ready to spill blood if a single word was twisted too far. Avaris spoke first, his voice smooth, a silken blade. The swarm is vast, and it is endless. Alone, each of our realms will be devoured in silence. Together, perhaps we may slow it, or perhaps we may purchase survival with sacrifice. If there is to be any pact, let it be one written in necessity, not pride. Sarathi's voice cut through like fire. Survival? You mean surrender, dressed in finer words. What would you offer the swarm? The bones of your own people, the ashes of your neighbors. Do you think it bargains, Avaris? It does not. It devours. The sovereign listened, though their heart was far from steady. The whispers from the night lingered, curling behind their ears, reminding them that Morbidis did not need pacts. And yet the councillors spoke as if deals could be struck, as if eternity could be purchased with scraps of betrayal. Perhaps it was folly. Perhaps it was the only path left. Avaris leaned forward, eyes gleaming. There are ways. We have all felt the shadow in our dreams. It speaks, does it not? Not in words, but in visions. I say it offers choice. And if choice is offered, it may be turned to our advantage. Perhaps we feed it what it craves most, in exchange for sparing what remains of us. We need only give it what we are willing to lose. The chamber shuddered with murmurs. Some nodded, their faces pale. Others hissed in fury, their pride refusing to bend. The sovereign felt the weight of their immortality pressing hard, binding them to silence. They knew the danger in admitting truth, that they too had heard the whispers, that they too had felt the pull. Yet in their stillness, they sensed the air's presence watching from the edge of the gathering, silent, uninvited, eyes burning with a strange anticipation. Finally, the sovereign's voice broke the noise, deep and cold as stone. You speak of bargaining with hunger, of offering flesh to shadow. But I tell you this, The swarm cannot be sated. What you offer will be devoured, and then it will devour you. There is no pact, no bargain, only delay. And delay buys us nothing but the illusion of hope. Avaris did not flinch. He smiled wider, a predator savoring the moment. Illusion or not, sovereign, hope is the only coin left to us. Better illusion than despair. The heir stepped forward then, unbidden, their voice carrying into the chamber. Perhaps both of you are right. The swarm does not bargain as we do, but it transforms what it consumes. To be devoured is not always to be ended. It is to become part of something greater, something endless. Perhaps the true pact is not to resist, but to choose how we are remade. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Rage flared in Sarath's eyes, her hand leaping toward the blade at her side. Blasphemy, she spat. You dare speak as if annihilation were salvation. The air stood unshaken, their gaze fixed on the sovereign. And you dare pretend that we have a choice left that does not end in fire. Look around you. Listen to the silence of our lost worlds. The swarm is not a storm to weather. It is the new sky under which we must live. We may curse it, but we cannot deny it. The only question is whether we enter it broken or enter it willing. The sovereign's breath caught, their hearts stilled. The vision returned of their heir standing untouched among the swarm, eyes burning with alien light. The words echoed with terrible familiarity. Was this prophecy unfolding or betrayal taking shape before their eyes? The chamber erupted into fury, voices clashing, curses hurled, oaths broken. Some demanded the heir's death, others argued for listening, for considering. In that storm of voices, the sovereign felt eternity tremble within them. They had thought their immortality unshakable, but now it cracked like glass under the weight of possibility. They raised a hand, and silence fell, though it was tense, brittle, ready to shatter again. The pact you seek, the sovereign said slowly, is not with one another. It is not with the swarm. It is with ourselves. We must decide what we are willing to become and what we refuse to surrender. Pride, eternity, flesh, soul. These are the coins upon the table. Choose poorly, and all will be lost. Choose wisely. Their voice trailed into silence, the words heavy with uncertainty. The council dispersed in fragments, each lord and lady carrying with them seeds of betrayal, whispers of alliance, and the poison of doubt. The sovereign remained behind, seated in the hollow dark. The air lingered too, eyes still fixed upon them, sharp and unreadable. When the chamber finally emptied, the sovereign whispered into the silence, words meant only for themselves. Perhaps we are already lost. Perhaps we only choose the manner of our ending. The banners above stirred in unseen currents, and in the distance the stars seemed to dim further, as if the swarm pressed closer, waiting, listening, feeding upon every word. And so the pact of forgotten stars was not sealed with unity, nor with blood, but with division. Its legacy was not alliance, but the quiet certainty that betrayal was already at hand, and that the descent had quickened into inevitability. The first betrayal came not with a declaration, but with silence. It began in the cold reaches of the frontier, where a fleet bound for duskfall failed to answer its calls. At first the sovereign believed it devoured, lost like so many others to the hunger pressing at the borders. Yet when wreckage did not arrive, when the void remained empty and the echoes of battle absent, the truth began to bleed through. Those ships had not fallen, they had turned. Their admiral, sworn to the eternal throne across generations, had carried them into the hands of rivals, feeding strength to those who smiled in secrecy at the pact of forgotten stars. The sovereign felt the knowledge sink into their marrow like ice. They had known betrayal would come, but not so swiftly, not so near. When word reached the throne world, the council fractured further. Voices rose in fury, demanding vengeance upon the traitors. Others, quieter but sharper, suggested the admiral had only done what the sovereign themselves refused, choosing survival in a world where loyalty no longer held meaning. The air said nothing at first, their silence heavy with knowing. When they finally spoke, their words were sharper than any blade. The fleet was not stolen, it was offered. They saw what you cannot. They knew the swarm cannot be resisted, and they sought a path you deny. Do not call them traitors when perhaps they are only visionaries. The sovereign's heart clenched at the words, yet they did not lash out. They saw in the eyes of the councillors that some agreed. To punish betrayal was simple when power was secure. But when power fractured, punishment itself became another form of weakness. Rage warred with silence inside them, but silence won. That night, the visions came again. The sovereign stood upon the decks of their lost fleet, but the soldiers who once bore their banners now bore no insignia at all. Their eyes were hollow, their flesh marked by faint ridges and scars that pulsed with strange light. They had not been consumed, but changed. They moved as one, silent, unyielding, as though bound by an invisible will. And at their center stood the air, untouched, radiant in the glow of alien hunger. When they reached out their hand, the sovereign awoke with a cry, the taste of ash in their mouth. Duskfall burned not long after. The swarm descended with its endless tide, and the remnants of loyal fleets were torn apart in moments. The sovereign stood at the great crystalline window, watching the distant stars flicker and vanish one by one as the Hive fleet consumed them. Reports flooded in, planets falling silent, garrisons disappearing without resistance, soldiers abandoning their posts to flee into the void. Among the chaos came whispers that some did not flee at all, but crossed willingly, ships surrendering themselves into the shadow without a single shot fired. It was then that Admiral Vanar entered once more, his face pale with the weight of despair. "My sovereign, we cannot hold the line. The people know it. The soldiers know it. They fight, yes, but they no longer believe. Already, more whispers spread, that your eternity blinds you, that you cannot understand what it is to die, to lose, to choose between fire and surrender. They say you will drag them all into the grave rather than bend." His voice cracked with bitterness, but there was truth beneath it. The sovereign turned slowly, their eyes burning with the shadow of centuries. "And what would you have me do, Admiral? Cast open our gates, lay our souls upon the altar of hunger, surrender not only our bodies, but our very meaning." Vanar bowed his head, trembling. "I would have you do what must be done to save even a fragment. If not surrender, then retreat. If not retreat, then deception. Anything but this stand against inevitability. Pride will not shield us. Eternity will not feed us. Only choice remains." The sovereign dismissed him with silence, though the words cut deeper than blades. For even as they clung to pride, they felt the truth gnawing. Eternity had always been their shield, but now it weighed like stone, dragging them down while others sought ways to survive, however twisted. The air came to them later, stepping into the darkened chamber as if summoned by the silence itself. "You see it now," they whispered, their eyes reflecting faint glimmers of something otherworldly. "You see that they no longer follow you. Not truly. They follow fear, and fear leads them elsewhere. You cannot bind them with eternity, for they are bound only by the present. They know the swarm will take them, and so they search for meaning in how they are taken. And their voice trembled, yet it carried a strange conviction. I have felt it more clearly than any of them. The swarm does not only devour, it remakes. It offers unity beyond betrayal, beyond pride. Perhaps we are meant to join it, not as slaves, but as something greater. The sovereign's hand shook, though they hid it in the folds of their robes. You would betray me, they whispered, though it came not as accusation, but as mourning. You would betray your blood, your people, everything we have held. The heir's eyes softened, and for a moment they looked not like a usurper, but a child. Not betray, save. You cannot see it, but I can. We have clung to ashes too long. Let us be reborn in the fire. If we resist, we vanish. If we embrace, we endure. The words echoed through the chamber like the tolling of a bell, and the sovereign felt the last defenses of their heart tremble. The dream returned, the vision of their heir untouched among the swarm, and they could no longer tell if it was warning or prophecy, perhaps both. Days later, confirmation arrived. The lost fleet that had vanished did not fall to Morbidis. It had joined it. Reports spoke of ships moving alongside the swarm, their guns silent, their signals drowned in psychic shadow. They did not fight. They did not flee. They simply moved as if they belonged. And those who had once sworn fealty to the throne were now faceless among the tide. The sovereign sat upon the black stone throne, hearing the cries of counselors demanding vengeance, demanding unity, demanding death. Yet their voice did not rise. They sat in silence, the weight of eternity pressing harder than ever, and whispered only to themselves, perhaps this is the end not of an empire, but of meaning itself. The banners above them stirred, torn and faded, as if even they whispered of betrayal. And beyond the walls the stars flickered one by one into darkness, each a wound carved by the descent of Hive fleet Morbidis. The sovereign closed their eyes, knowing the true war had not yet begun, not against the swarm, but against the blood that waited in silence, ready to turn the knife when the moment came. The shadow of Morbidis at last breached the veil of the throne system, and with it came the silence of 1,000 deaths. Signals from the outer moons flickered, then vanished into nothing, their voices swallowed whole before a single plea could cross the void. The swarm's vanguard spilled into real space like a tide of living night, wings of chitin vast as cities, their bodies trailing streams of bioluminescent fire. They were not ships, but creatures, each one pulsing with a rhythm older than stars, each one hungering without pause. The fleets that remained loyal to the sovereign gathered in desperate formation, their prows turned outward, their cannons glowing faint with readiness. Yet in their hearts there was only dread. For the soldiers saw what their leaders would not admit. This was not a battle to be won. It was a drowning, and they were already waist-deep in the flood. The sovereign watched from the crystal window, their eyes fixed upon the abyss beyond. The swarm's psychic weight pressed against them even here, hammering against their mind like waves upon stone. They had endured centuries without bending, yet in the marrow of their bones they felt something crack. They remembered every campaign, every oath, every sacrifice that had built this empire, and now all of it trembled upon the edge of annihilation. Their immortality, once a fortress, felt instead like a curse, chaining them to witness the death of all they had sworn to protect. Pride told them to fight until the last flame guttered. Weariness whispered that surrender might be mercy. The air stood at their side, silent until the horizon of stars lit with the burning of the first engagement. They are not resisting, the air said softly, almost reverently. They are being unmade and remade. Do you not feel it? Each life taken joins something larger. Each death does not vanish. It flows into the swarm. There is no loneliness in them, only belonging. The sovereign did not answer. They could not, for the words carried echoes of their own unspoken thoughts, the whispers they had denied in the solitude of their chamber. Instead, they watched as the first fleet lines broke. Ships that had once borne their banners dissolved into clouds of fire and ash. Their screams cut short as the swarm tore through them without pause. And then, amidst the carnage, they saw something worse. Ships turning, not destroyed, but joining. Engines flared, prows shifted, and guns that had once fired in defense now fell silent. The swarm embraced them not with claws, but with silence, and they moved as though they had always been part of it. Reports flooded the council chamber in frantic bursts. Admiral Vaynar's voice cracked with fury as he broadcast from the front, urging the sovereign to commit the reserves, to hold the line for one more hour, one more moment. His words were punctured by static, and then by screams, and then by silence. The sovereign closed their eyes, hearing the silence heavier than any sound. In the hall behind them, the councillors broke into chaos. Some demanded retreat, others demanded execution of those who faltered. Lady Sarath stood with her crimson robes burning under the torchlight, her voice sharp as steel. This is treachery. They do not fall to the swarm. They join it, cut them down, destroy their families, their lines, all who even whisper the word surrender. Her fury was a flame, but it was too small against the storm. Lord Avaris, ever the serpent, smiled faintly. Or perhaps we should consider why they turn. Perhaps they see what you refuse to see. The swarm is not merely death, it is destiny. Why destroy those who have glimpsed it first? Why not follow where they lead? The sovereign rose from their throne, and the chamber fell silent, though beneath the silence trembled fear and rage. Enough, they said, their voice heavy as the stones above them. There will be no surrender. There will be no embrace. We will fight, even if it means we fall alone. Yet even as they spoke the words, they felt the hollowness beneath them. For in the depths of their heart, they no longer believed. The heir stepped forward, their gaze fixed upon them. You speak of fighting alone, but you are not alone. I am here, and I tell you now, the people will not follow you into silence. They will follow me because I see what you deny. I see the future not as ashes, but as transformation. You cannot hold them with pride, sovereign, but I can lead them into what comes next. Gasps rippled through the chamber. It was not yet open rebellion, but it was close enough. Sarath spat curses, demanding the heir's arrest. Avaris only smiled, seeing opportunity unfold like a blade unsheathed. The sovereign's hand trembled upon the arm of their throne. To order the heir seized would fracture what little loyalty remained. To let them speak was to allow the shadow of betrayal to grow unchecked. The swarm answered the question for them. A shudder rolled through the throne world as the outermost defense moons went dark. Their lights blinked out one by one, and in the sudden silence that followed, the psychic weight of Morbidis pressed deeper, filling the very marrow of every living soul. The sovereign felt their eternity strain under it, as though the swarm itself sought to unravel the secret of their undying flesh. For a heartbeat, they felt themselves pulled, their will no longer entirely their own. And in that heartbeat, they felt belonging, terrible, absolute, undeniable. They tore themselves back with a cry, collapsing against the throne. The councillors rushed forward in panic, their voices shrill, but the sovereign's gaze was fixed only on the heir. The child's eyes glowed faint with reflected hunger, as if the swarm itself had already claimed them. The vision from their dreams returned, sharper than ever, and the sovereign knew then that prophecy and betrayal were no longer separate things. They were one. The council fled in disorder, the court breaking into factions, even as the swarm consumed the stars above. The sovereigns sat in silence, their breath heavy, their eternity trembling. Outside, the battle raged, though it was not truly a battle, but a drowning. Each ship swallowed one after the other, each soldier's scream falling into the endless chorus of hunger. And amid that chorus, the air's words lingered like poison and promise both. The sovereign pressed a hand to their chest, feeling the weight of centuries press back. "I am eternal," they whispered, though their voice cracked. "I will not be yours." But the swarm's silence answered, vast and patient, as if eternity itself were nothing more than a delay. And so the shadow of Hive Fleet Morbidis did not merely descend upon the throne system. It entered hearts, broke loyalties, and whispered to every soul that stood between hunger and surrender. The sovereigns still sat upon their throne, but already the ground beneath them cracked, and in the eyes of their own heir, they saw the future rising, not in fire, but in belonging to the endless night. The banners of loyalty still clung to the walls of the throne hall, but their colors had faded to dust, their cloth torn where unseen winds pressed through the cracks of stone. The sovereigns sat beneath them, heavy with the silence that had settled after the council's collapse. No proclamations had been made, no unity sworn. Only divisions sharper than any blade lingered, and within each pair of eyes had burned the seed of rebellion. Some looked upon the air with awe, others with fear, but all had seen what the sovereign could not erase. The old order was fracturing, and eternity was no longer enough to bind it. Reports trickled in, fragmented, half choked by interference. Fleets faltered at the edge of the system, some fighting desperately, others vanishing without word. Refugees poured inward, whispering that their defenders had not fallen, but joined the shadow. Stories spread of soldiers who laid down their arms and walked into the swarm as though into a homecoming, their screams not of terror, but of surrender. The sovereign knew not how much was true, for truth itself bent beneath the weight of fear. Yet one thing was certain: loyalty, the chain that bound the empire, was breaking link by link. They rose at last from the throne, robes dragging like stone across the floor, and moved to the great crystalline window. Beyond, the swarm thickened, vast wings unfolding across the void, each creature a cathedral of living hunger. Their minds pressed upon the sovereign's own like waves of heat, searing against the immortality that had so long endured. They whispered without words, their silence louder than thunder, and the sovereign felt the tug within their marrow, not compulsion, but invitation. The air entered, their steps soft against the ancient floor. They did not bow, not anymore. Their eyes gleamed with a strange light, not wholly their own, as if they carried within them the echo of something vast and patient. "The people speak of you," they said quietly, their voice neither mocking nor pleading. "They say you will not bend. They say you will let them all burn before you yield. They no longer know if you fight for them or for your pride alone." The sovereign turned slowly, their gaze heavy, sorrow carved deep into the lines of their immortal face. "And what would you have me do, child? Cast down our banners, kneel upon the altar of hunger and call it salvation? I have lived centuries, and in all that time I have learned one truth. There is no salvation in surrender, only erasure." The heir's lips curved faintly, not in cruelty, but in inevitability. You speak of erasure as though it is death, but perhaps it is freedom. You have carried eternity like a burden, watching all you loved turn to ash. Perhaps belonging is not a curse, but a release. You cling to pride because it is all you have left, but pride will not save them. The people need more than defiance. They need hope, even if that hope lies in transformation. The sovereign's hand trembled against the glass of the window. For a moment, they saw themselves reflected there, but the reflection was not their own. Their skin was cracked with bioluminescent veins, their eyes black with hunger, their body both human and not. And yet, within the reflection, there was no loneliness, no weariness, no endless burden of eternity, only belonging. They tore their gaze away with a gasp, clutching at the folds of their robe as if to anchor themselves in what remained of their humanity. The hall doors burst open then, and Sarath strode inside, her crimson robes torn, her face marked with ash. She fell to her knees, voice breaking. My sovereign, the fortress moons have fallen. Entire legions vanished, their commanders gone without resistance. I swear it upon my blood. They did not fight. They opened their gates. They joined the swarm. Her words shattered against the stone like glass, and her body trembled with fury. We are being devoured from within, not by their claws, but by the weakness of our own. The sovereign looked upon her, and for the first time in centuries, they felt the weight of helplessness. Their empire was not burning because of Morbidis alone. It was burning because the bonds of loyalty that had held it together had withered, because betrayal was no longer an act of treachery, but a choice of survival. The heir stepped closer, eyes fixed upon Saratha. They are not weak, they said softly, their words carrying a strange calm. They are not devoured, they are transformed. They chose not to die alone, but to become part of something greater. You call it betrayal, but perhaps it is the only loyalty that remains. Loyalty to survival. Sarath spat at their feet, eyes blazing with hatred. Heretic, she hissed. You speak with the tongue of the swarm. You would see us all swallowed to feed your vision. She looked up at the sovereign, her voice breaking. If you do not silence them, sovereign, then your blood itself is the traitor that dooms us. The sovereign's voice rose, heavy as a tomb. Enough. The word echoed through the hall, silencing both. Their gaze swept between Saratha and the air, torn between fire and shadow. For a heartbeat, they saw both futures, one where pride held to the last breath, another where the empire dissolved into belonging with the swarm. Both ended in loss. When Sarath was dismissed, the heir lingered. They looked upon the sovereign not as ruler, not as parent, but as one already half consumed by inevitability. You will have to choose, they whispered, not between survival and death, but between loneliness and belonging. The people will not wait forever, and neither will I. The sovereign remained alone again, the silence pressing tighter than ever. They moved once more to the throne, sitting with the weight of centuries collapsing upon their shoulders. Their immortality no longer felt like strength. It felt like chains, binding them to choices that had no end but sorrow. Beyond the window, the swarm thickened, the stars fading one by one into the endless tide. They closed their eyes, and the voices came again. Not words, but impressions. Hunger, yes, but not cruel. Silence, yes, but not empty. A sense of unity beyond betrayal, beyond pride, beyond loneliness. For a moment, the sovereign allowed it in, and in that moment they felt peace. A terrible peace, vast and eternal, in which their burdens dissolved into something larger than themselves. They opened their eyes with a shudder. the peace lingering like ash upon the tongue. The hall was empty, the banners torn, the empire trembling. And in their heart, they knew the air was right. They would have to choose. Pride or surrender, eternity or belonging. Both paths ended in ruin, but one offered silence alone, the other silence shared. And as the shadow of Morbidis spread across the throne world, the sovereign whispered into the emptiness, "If I fall, let it not be alone." The banners stirred, and the silence of the swarm pressed closer, as though it had heard. The fall of the Duskfall sector had been a wound, but the feast of silence that followed broke something deeper. Where once desperate signals screamed through the void, now there was only stillness, as though the worlds themselves had ceased to breathe. The swarm had not merely consumed, it had erased. Yet the rumors that returned with the few who escaped were worse than silence. They spoke of garrisons who laid down their weapons and walked willingly into the tide, of cities that opened their gates and let the creatures swarm through the streets, not in panic, but in calm surrender. Entire populations vanished without struggle, as if they had chosen to belong rather than resist. These whispers spread faster than fire, infecting the hearts of those still clinging to loyalty. And as they spread, so too did fear that resistance itself was the true madness. The sovereigns sat in their private sanctum, the walls lined with reliquaries of 1,000 campaigns. Swords that had drunk blood until their hilts were black. Armor that bore the scars of wars against enemies whose names were already forgotten. All relics of triumph now reduced to ghosts. They ran their hand along the edge of one such relic, a shattered helm that had once belonged to a brother-in-arms long dead, and for the first time in centuries they felt the absence of meaning. Victories that once seemed eternal had dissolved into dust, and now their eternity itself felt as fragile as bone. The air entered without warning, their face lit by the strange half-glow that seemed to follow them since the swarm drew near. They no longer needed to speak loudly. Their words carried with unnatural weight, as though the silence itself lent them power. "You feel it too," they said, their voice quiet, certain. "You feel the pull. It whispers to you as it whispers to me. You deny it still, but in your heart you know. This is not destruction. It is a gathering." The sovereign's jaw tightened, but their hand shook upon the relic they touched. "Gathering," they spat softly. "You dress annihilation in gentler words. Do you not see what they become? Do you not hear their voices swallowed whole?" The air stepped closer, their gaze sharp, luminous. "I hear them. That is the truth. They do not vanish. They join. Their cries are not screams but hymns. You fear being alone forever, and yet here is a unity vast beyond anything you have ever ruled. Is that not what you sought when you bound yourself to eternity? A kingdom without end. Perhaps you were only seeking this all along." The words cut deep because within them was a reflection of thoughts the sovereign had buried. In the endless nights of immortality, they had wondered what it might be to belong, to no longer endure the loneliness of centuries. Now the swarm pressed that dream against their flesh, and still they resisted, though the resistance grew weaker with each passing hour. The council reconvened in haste, summoned not by loyalty, but by terror. The chamber rang with voices shrill and broken. Lady Sarath stood with her face pale, no longer aflame with defiance, but hollow with dread. "The swarm has devoured half the system. Our fleets crumble. Our soldiers desert. Already there are riots in the streets, families demanding we open the gates before the creatures take them by force. If we do not act, the people themselves will deliver us to the swarm. Lord Avaris, calm and smiling as ever, spread his hands in mock reason. And why should they not? Better to offer ourselves than be torn apart. Better to enter willingly than to be dragged. Perhaps it is wisdom to bow before inevitability, rather than die clutching dust. His words drew nods from many, and silence from more. Only a few still spat curses, clinging to oaths that had already frayed. The sovereign rose, their presence momentarily silencing the hall, their voice carried with the weight of centuries. You speak as if surrender is choice. It is not. Once you kneel, you are no longer. You think you preserve yourselves, but what you become will not be you. You call it wisdom. I call it erasure. If you would go, then go. But do not expect to return. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, fear and anger and temptation colliding. The heir stepped forward then, standing not beside the sovereign, but before them. You are wrong, they said, their voice calm, resolute. It is not erasure, it is continuation. We may lose ourselves, yes, but we gain everything. A unity that cannot betray, cannot fracture, cannot rot as your empire has. You have built walls to keep the galaxy out, and still it has crumbled. But the swarm, there are no walls, only belonging. The chamber erupted, some crying for blood, others falling silent in the face of the heir's words. The sovereign's breath caught in their chest, for they saw now that the heir's voice carried more weight than their own. The people would follow them. The soldiers would follow them. Perhaps even the council would follow them. And in that realization lay the taste of betrayal sharper than any knife. That night, the sovereign walked the halls alone, their footsteps echoing in chambers that once held the laughter of allies long dead. They passed murals of victories, of empires bent beneath their banners, but the faces in those murals seemed to mock them now. They felt the swarm pressing closer with every step, pressing into their thoughts, their dreams, their marrow. And once again, the visions came. They saw themselves upon a field of bone, their empire scattered, their banners torn. Yet they were not alone. Around them stretched countless forms, human and inhuman, fused into one chorus. They felt the hunger, but they also felt peace. They felt belonging, and at the center of it all, the heir stood with arms outstretched, radiant with alien light, calling them to join. The sovereign woke trembling, sweat cold upon their brow, though their flesh no longer needed such frailty. They whispered to the empty hall, to the ghosts of banners and blades. Am I already yours, or have I been yours from the beginning? Beyond the walls, the throne world trembled as panic spread through the streets. Refugees whispered of surrender. Soldiers deserted their posts, and banners of the old empire were torn down and burned. In their place rose silence, a silence not yet of death, but of waiting. The people no longer looked to the sovereign. They looked to the heir, whose words spread like fire, whose voice promised not annihilation, but a future without loneliness. And as Hive fleet Morbidis coiled tighter around the system, the sovereign knew the moment was coming, when loyalty itself would shatter, when the people would choose belonging over defiance, when the last oath sworn to them would dissolve. Their eternity had been forged to withstand death, but not this, not betrayal, not the slow surrender of every soul they had sworn to protect. In the silence of that night, they felt the weight of inevitabilities pressing down, and for the first time in all their centuries, they wept, not for themselves, but for the empire already lost, and for the heir who would lead what remained into the endless hunger. The night above the throne world no longer glittered with the comfort of familiar constellations. The stars were eclipsed by wings of shadow, the great bodies of the swarm drifting in silence like cathedrals of flesh and bone. Each one pulsed with alien rhythm, a heartbeat older than time, and every soul beneath their gaze felt the weight of that pulse. It was not war that hung over the world now, but judgment. The sovereign stood upon the balcony of their chamber, the wind tugging at robes heavy with dust and memory, and felt the silence of the swarm press against their chest like a hand. Their eternity, once unyielding, trembled under it. Pride told them to resist. Weariness whispered otherwise. Below, the streets burned with unrest. Crowds surged through avenues once carved for triumphal processions, their chants fractured between curses and prayers. Some cried for defiance, others for surrender. Still more whispered the name of the air as though it were salvation. Soldiers struggled to hold the lines, but their eyes betrayed hesitation. They no longer knew whom they served. Some still looked to the sovereign, others already bent toward the air, and more still gazed at the heavens as though waiting to be claimed. Loyalty fractured, not in battle, but in the marrow of the people themselves. The air had vanished from the chamber hours before, slipping into the city without guard or herald. Rumors spread swiftly of their presence among the people, walking unafraid in the midst of chaos, speaking words that calmed the furious and stilled the fearful. Whispers claimed the swarm's shadow parted where they stood, that no creature dared descend upon the streets where their voice was heard. Others swore they saw the faint shimmer of alien light in their eyes, proof of something more than mortal. The sovereign's spies returned with conflicting accounts, but one truth was undeniable. The people listened. And where the sovereign's decrees fell upon deaf ears, the air's words rooted deep, binding hearts more tightly than centuries of banners had ever managed. In the council hall, the last remnants of authority frayed. Lady Sarath demanded the air's arrest, her voice a ragged scream that cracked with desperation. She spat blood upon the stones and called them heretic, traitor, the harbinger of doom. Yet even as she spoke, her followers dwindled, their faces shadowed with doubt. Lord Avaris, serpent, smiled, spoke the words none wished to hear aloud. If the air commands loyalty where you cannot, sovereign, then perhaps they are already sovereign in truth. Perhaps the choice has already been made. His voice slithered across the chamber, not accusation, but invitation, daring the others to follow. The sovereign said nothing. Their silence was heavier than steel, but silence was no longer enough to command. For the first time in centuries, their presence did not silence the hall. The councillors argued over one another, voices clashing, oaths shattering, until the chamber itself seemed to weep with the weight of disunity. They left one by one, not dismissed but disillusioned, each retreating to guard their own fragment of power, their own fading torch against the night. The sovereign remained alone, the echoes of betrayal ringing louder than any declaration of war. That night, dreams came again. The sovereign walked through streets not of stone, but of flesh, walls pulsing with veins that glowed like distant suns. Around them, the people moved silently, their faces serene, their bodies marked by the alien shimmer of transformation. They did not cry, did not curse, did not betray. They moved as one, endless, unbroken. And at the center, upon a throne not of stone, but of living chitin, sat the air, radiant in silence, their eyes burning with hunger not their own. When they looked upon the sovereign, it was not with defiance, but with invitation. Come, the dream whispered without words. You have carried eternity alone. Lay it down. Belong. The sovereign woke with a gasp, their chest heavy, their mind raw. For the first time, they longed for the end, not as death, but as release from the chains of immortality. The dream had shown them a peace they had never known, a peace their pride forbade, but their soul yearned for. They rose unsteady, moving through the silent corridors of the palace, their footsteps echoing where once armies had marched. In the courtyard, they found the heir waiting. No guards stood between them, no banners separated them, only silence. The heir's eyes glimmered faint in the moonlight, reflecting the swarm above like mirrors. "You see it now," they said, their voice quiet but carrying, as though the air itself bent to carry it. "You see, there is no defiance left, no loyalty strong enough to hold what you built. The people are ready. They do not fear belonging. They fear being left alone in the dark. Give them what they need. Let me lead them." The sovereign looked into those eyes and saw both child and stranger, blood and betrayer, promise and doom. Their voice was low, broken by centuries. "You would take from me everything. My throne, my people, my eternity. And yet you believe it is salvation." The heir did not flinch. "I would take nothing. I would carry what you no longer can. You were eternity, sovereign, but eternity has grown weary. Let it end with you. Let what follows be mine." The sovereign turned away, their gaze upon the heavens, where the swarm thickened with every passing moment. "You do not know what it means to be eternal. You do not know the weight of centuries." The air's voice softened, though it carried the sting of truth. "No, but I know what it means to belong, and that is a weight you have never borne." The silence that followed was heavier than any battle. For a moment, the sovereign thought to strike them down, to silence the betrayal before it could consume everything. But their hand did not move. Their eternity had seen too much, endured too much. Their pride had carried them this far, but pride alone could not hold back the tide. And so they stood, weary, unyielding yet trembling, knowing that choice itself was slipping from their grasp. The swarm's silence pressed deeper into the marrow of the world. The banners above the city burned in the riots, replaced not with symbols, but with nothing at all. The people no longer carried signs of empire, only the weight of waiting. They were ready to choose or to be chosen. The sovereign returned to their chamber, their throne looming before them like a tomb. They lowered themselves onto it, their body heavy, their eternity fractured. They whispered into the empty hall, words not for counselors or armies, but for the silence itself. "If I fall, let it be not in pride, but in meaning. If I end, let me end where belonging waits." And in the stillness that followed, they felt the swarm's silence stir, patient, endless, inevitable. The choice was no longer theirs alone. It was already being made, not by thrones or banners, but by the countless hearts that no longer feared the tide. The sovereign closed their eyes. The hall was silent. The world trembled, and the shadow of Hive fleet Morbidis pressed closer, as though listening. The siege of Duskfall had been a whisper of what was to come, but the betrayal at Duskfall was the knife that sank into the sovereign's heart. Reports arrived broken, carried in fragments through the static-laden void. The fleet had held for 3 days against impossible odds, clinging to hope with bloodied hands until the heir's voice reached them. None knew how it carried across the storm of interference, how it wove itself into the comms as if it had always been there. But soldiers swore they heard it, calm and steady, urging them to stop fighting, to join rather than burn. At first, they resisted. Then one by one, ships turned their guns away, their prows shifting not against the swarm, but into formation beside it. Within hours, half the fleet had abandoned the banner of the throne, and the other half burned under the weight of betrayal. The sovereign sat rigid upon the throne as the transmissions flickered to silence. The cries of loyalty, the screams of betrayal, the desperate calls for command, all vanished into the same stillness that had swallowed 1,000 worlds. They felt their eternity tremble within their chest, a weight too vast for flesh to contain. Betrayal was not new. They had endured it across centuries, but never had it come from so close, never from the blood that carried their line. The vision of their heir among the swarm returned sharper than ever, no longer prophecy, but reality unfolding. Admiral Vaynar entered the chamber, his armor cracked, his voice raw from command. He fell to one knee, rage quivering in his body. My sovereign, the heir has doomed us. They spread poison in the hearts of our own, and now duskfall is ash. We must cut them down before all is lost. Command it, and I will see their blood spilled, even if it costs my life. His words rang with loyalty, but his loyalty trembled beneath the shadow of despair. The sovereign's gaze was heavy, their voice low, hollow. If I strike them now, it will not save us. The people will see martyrdom, not treason. They will see hope silenced, not betrayal punished, and they will follow their memory, even if I burn the body. Vaynar's face twisted with anguish. Then what is left? Do we fight the swarm or our own blood? The banners burn, the fleets falter, and still they look to the air as if they were savior. Say the word, sovereign, and I will raise the blade myself. Better to end them now than watch the galaxy bool. But the sovereign did not answer. Their silence was heavier than decrees, and Vaynar, broken and furious, departed with curses upon his lips, though even his curses carried sorrow. That night, the sovereign walked the empty halls of the palace, the stones echoing with memories long dead. They remembered the day the heir was born, the laughter that had filled the chamber, rare and bright. They remembered watching them grow, sharp-eyed, restless, hungry for more than banners and rituals. Perhaps the betrayal had begun even then, when the heir looked beyond the throne's walls with a gaze too curious, too bold. Perhaps it had begun the moment eternity forged its chains around the sovereign, and the heir knew they would never be more than a shadow beneath that weight. In the streets below, riots broke into war. Citizens tore down the banners of the empire, some burning them, others laying them upon the ground like offerings to the sky. Soldiers clashed not with the swarm but with each other, loyalty dissolving into faction. The heir walked among them, unarmed, untouched. Wherever they passed, the crowds parted, not in fear but in reverence. Witnesses swore the swarm itself recoiled, its vanguard halting at the city's edge as though waiting, as though listening. Some fell to their knees when the heir spoke, not from command, but from relief, as if their voices gave permission to lay down centuries of fear. The sovereign heard these reports with a hollow heart. They knew then that the heir no longer needed the throne to rule. The people had already given it to them. Eternity had lost its weight against a single voice that promised belonging. The council fractured in finality. Siratha, still spitting curses, fled to rally what remained of the loyalists, though few followed. Avaris, serpent to the end, vanished into the shadows, no doubt carrying schemes into whichever future survived. The others melted away, abandoning oaths sworn in blood for whispers of survival. The throne was no longer a beacon, but a tomb, and the sovereign sat within it, bound by the silence of ages. The heir came to them once more, unguarded, fearless. Their eyes burned brighter now, the shimmer of alien hunger woven into their gaze. They did not kneel, did not bow. They only stood, their presence filling the chamber as though the swarm itself watched through them. "It is over," they said quietly. "The people are mine. The fleets are mine. Even the swarm waits for me. You cannot hold them anymore. Let go." The sovereign's voice cracked, a whisper dragged across stone. "You are my blood, my heir, my child, and you betray me." The heir's face softened, and for a fleeting moment there was sorrow in their eyes. "I do not betray you. I fulfill what you began. You sought eternity alone. I offer it to all. You clung to pride. I give them belonging. This is not betrayal, sovereign. It is succession." The sovereign's heart shattered beneath the words, but no tears came. Eternity had stripped them of such release long ago. They rose from the throne, every motion heavy, and placed a hand upon the heir's shoulder. For a moment, they felt the warmth of flesh, the blood they had once cradled. For a moment, they believed. And then they withdrew, their hand trembling. "Then take it," they whispered, their voice hollow. "Take it all, if you can bear it. But know this, eternity is not belonging. It is burden. And one day, it will crush you as it crushed me." The heir met their gaze without flinching. "Then let it crush me. At least I will not carry it alone." They turned and left, their steps echoing into the night, and with them went the last fragments of loyalty. The banners above the throne stirred one final time, and the sovereign knew the truth. Betrayal was no longer betrayal. It was the end of their reign, the end of their eternity, the end of everything they had ever built. And as the swarm closed tighter around the world, as silence pressed deeper into every soul, the sovereign whispered to the emptiness, "If this is the end, let it be remembered not as fall, but as descent." The silence answered, vast and patient, and the betrayal at duskfall was complete. The silent eclipse began without fire. It was not heralded by the roar of guns or the clash of fleets, but by the extinguishing of light itself. One by one, the moons that circled the throne world darkened, their beacons snuffed out as though an unseen hand had drawn curtains across the heavens. Where once they had blazed as guardians, they now hung in the void as hollow stones, their silence heavier than any bombardment. The swarm drifted between them, vast bodies gliding with the patience of eternity, their shadows eclipsing not just the stars, but the very memory of dawn. The sovereign stood upon the highest spire of the palace, their robes dragging through the dust of centuries, their eyes fixed upon the sky that no longer belonged to them. They had seen 1,000 eclipses in their endless reign, had watched suns swallowed by void, but this was different. This eclipse did not pass. It lingered, absolute, as if the swarm itself had become the sky. Every breath of the world below trembled beneath its weight, and the sovereign's heart knew that no fleet, no throne, no eternity could hold against it. The city was already breaking. In the streets, cries rose like smoke, fractured between despair and ecstasy. Some threw down their arms and fled toward the gates, seeking to be taken by the creatures that lurk just beyond the walls. Others clawed at the stones, desperate to build barricades against the tide. Factions fought in alleys, neighbor turning on neighbor, not from hatred, but from the unbearable weight of choice, whether to die in defiance or surrender to belonging. And always, above their voices, rose whispers of the air. Their names spread like a hymn, spoken with reverence, with hope, with surrender. The sovereign descended into the throne hall, its vast emptiness echoing with the ghosts of councils long dissolved. The banners above hung limp, their colours ash, their meaning stripped. Upon the black stone seat, they lowered themselves once more, their body heavy, their eternity cracking within. For the first time, they felt the true meaning of loneliness. Not the loneliness of centuries, not the loneliness of immortality, but the loneliness of being abandoned while still alive. Their people no longer looked to them. Their armies no longer obeyed. Even their blood had turned away. The throne was theirs, but it was hollow, a tomb carved from pride. Then came the sound, not the roar of engines or the clash of weapons, but a low hum that vibrated through stone and bone alike. It was not sound but resonance, a psychic tide that filled the marrow of every living thing. The sovereign clutched at the arms of their seat as the hum deepened, growing not louder but closer, until it was inside them, a second heartbeat echoing within their eternity. The swarm was not at the gates. It was already here, pressing against the walls of flesh and soul. The doors opened and the air entered, walking with steps unhurried, as though the weight of the eclipse did not touch them. Their eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, reflecting the unseen light of the swarm above. No guard accompanied them, no counsel followed. They needed none. The silence that trailed them was their escort, the stillness of thousands who already followed their voice. They stopped before the throne, looking up at the sovereign not with defiance, but with inevitability. "It has begun," they said, their voice carrying in the vast chamber without effort. The people no longer resist. They walk into the shadow as though into a sanctuary. They are not afraid. They are ready. The sovereign's voice cracked, the sound of stone breaking. "And what of me? Am I to be cast aside, remembered only as the last fool who clung to pride while the world surrendered?" The heir's gaze softened, though their eyes still burned with alien light. "You will not be forgotten. You will be the last sovereign, the one who carried eternity alone until it broke you. But you need not be alone anymore. The swarm does not erase, it gathers. You fear being lost, but there is no loss in belonging. Come with us. End your eternity. Begin ours." The sovereign's hand trembled upon the arm of the throne. They saw again the visions that had haunted their dreams, their air radiant among the swarm, the people serene in their transformation, themselves kneeling upon the field of bone. Each time they had resisted, but now, with the eclipse pressing upon them, with their throne hollow and their pride broken, resistance felt like ashes. For centuries they had borne the weight of immortality, watched empires rise and rot, seen loyalty turn to betrayal, and endured the silence of eternity. What was left to hold? They rose slowly, every motion heavy with the weight of centuries. Their eyes locked upon the heirs, and for the first time, they saw not betrayal, but promise, not loss, but an end to loneliness. They stepped down from the throne, the sound of their footsteps echoing like the tolling of a bell. Yet even as they drew near, doubt coiled once more. They turned their gaze to the window where the swarm's shadows writhed across the sky. In that vastness, they saw not peace, but hunger. A hunger that could never end, a hunger that cared nothing for thrones or names. Was this truly belonging, or was it annihilation dressed in serenity? The heir extended their hand, palm open, eyes unwavering. "Do not fear it. 'Tis not death. 'Tis not betrayal. It is release. You have carried too long. Let it go." The sovereign's hand lifted, trembling, hovering above their heirs. For a moment, they nearly yielded. For a moment, they longed to let eternity slip from their grasp, to dissolve into something greater than themselves. But pride, fragile though it was, still clung to their bones. They lowered their hand, their voice breaking into the silence. "Not yet. Not while I can still choose. If I fall, it will be upon my own terms, not theirs." The heir's face did not change. They only nodded, as though expecting the answer, as though the choice itself no longer mattered. Then the choice will be made for you. The eclipse is already here. And as they turned and left the hall, their figure fading into the shadows, the sovereign felt the hum deepen, pressing tighter, burrowing deeper, unraveling the chains of eternity one thread at a time. The silent eclipse was not of sun or moon, but of meaning itself. And beneath its shadow, the sovereign knew their time was ending, whether by choice or by surrender. The sky above the throne world fractured without sound. It did not explode. It did not scream. It simply opened, like the surface of still water pierced by something vast and unseen. The swarm descended in absolute quiet, wings of bone and bioluminescence drifting like sacred banners through the atmosphere, their motion serene, reverent. Where the creatures passed, fire did not follow. Instead, silence bloomed, the kind of silence that buried resistance before it could take root. The first spires fell, not by bombardment, but by surrender. Defense grids dimmed, gates unlocked, and the people emerged not with weapons, but with open hands. The sovereigns stood alone at the edge of the inner courtyard, their boots pressed against the polished stone where generations of warriors had once marched in ceremony. Above them, the great dome flickered as its shielding began to collapse, not from damage, but from abandonment. The system that once wrapped the palace in impenetrable light now blinked with uncertainty, unsure whether to defend or yield. The engineers had fled days ago, their loyalty overtaken by whispers in the dark. The last of the defenders had stood this morning, but the sovereign had watched as they too laid down their arms and walked out, silent and calm, joining the tide of civilians that gathered in the temple square. Across the plaza, the air waited, not with armies or banners, but alone, their silhouettes still against the stone, eyes cast upward as the sky unfolded. Behind them rose the mass of the swarm, not as an army, but as an atmosphere draped in silence. Its presence was no longer threatening. It was devotional. The creatures did not strike. They hovered in perfect suspension, watching, waiting, listening for something already decided. The sovereign stepped forward, each movement slow, heavy with memory. They wore no crown now. It had been set aside days before, placed upon the altar of their ancestors, not in reverence, but in quiet farewell. Their robes were torn, streaked with dust and ash, their armor long removed. They came not as ruler, but as relic. The air turned as they approached, offering no smile, no gesture, only patience. They were different now. The last traces of the child they had raised were gone, replaced by something ageless, not immortal like the sovereign, but unburdened. They stopped a few paces apart. For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, the people watched in silence, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the swarm. There was no panic, no fear. The crowd did not flinch as the creatures drifted closer, their limbs folding like wings of cathedral glass. The sovereign broke the silence, their voice softer than it had ever been, brittle as old stone. "Is this what you wanted?" The air looked into their eyes, the swarm glinting faintly in their gaze. "It was never what I wanted. It was what became necessary." The sovereign's gaze flicked to the sky, where the great vessels of Morbidis passed overhead in quiet procession. And they, what do they want? The air's voice was low, reverent. Not want. They are. They do not hunger for conquest. They hunger for purpose. And we have wandered too long without it. The sovereign's hands curled slightly. I gave them purpose. I gave them order, survival, pride. And they abandoned it for silence. You gave them permanence, the air said gently, but not peace. A long stillness passed between them. The sovereign looked to the crowd, to the faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the swarm's descent. They saw no terror there, only relief. A collective breath finally exhaled after centuries of war, decay, and disillusionment. The people were not conquered. They were being unburdened. I was not made to bend, the sovereign whispered, eyes locked on the horizon, where the last loyal bastion, a distant mountain fortress, flickered and then went dark. I know, said the air, but you were not made to break either. You chose to carry the weight. Let me carry it now. The sovereign turned to them slowly, their eternity shivering within. And what are you now? My air still, or something else? I am what you could not be, the air answered without pride. I am not eternal, but I am part of something that is. A cry broke from the crowd, not of alarm, but of awe. One of the great swarm creatures descended, its massive form folding like silk, legs bending with priestly reverence. It knelt in the square, silent, unmoving, its presence a cathedral of stillness. The people dropped to their knees in answer, one by one, like waves spreading outward. The sovereign did not kneel, but they did not flee. The air stepped forward, extending their hand. This is the last moment of choice, not for them, for you. The sovereign looked at the hand, then to the people, then to the swarm. Their pride screamed, their memory burned, but their eternity, so long a fortress, now felt like a tomb. Their people were already gone, transformed not by force, but by relief. What remained to defend? What remained to rule? And yet, surrender was not easy. They reached for the heir's hand, but did not take it. Instead, they asked, "And if I choose defiance?" The heir's voice held sorrow. "Then you will be the last voice in an empty hall, and even eternity cannot echo forever." A single tear, something the sovereign had not shed in centuries, slid down their cheek, vanishing into the dust at their feet. Then, with a breath that tasted of ash and memory, they reached forward and took the heir's hand. The hum deepened, the sky pulsed. The swarm descended not in wrath, but in embrace. The great creature before them bowed its head lower, and the crowd rose, not in rebellion, but in reverence. The sovereign stood beside the heir, no longer ruler, no longer burdened. Above, Hive fleet Morbidis coiled gently around the world, not as predator, but as veil. And in that stillness, the throne world exhaled. Its last age ended. The eclipse was complete. The choice had been made. And beneath the hush of wings, the galaxy watched. They stood together beneath the shadow of the kneeling beast, sovereign and heir, blood and echo, surrounded not by armies, but by silence. Above them, the veil of the swarm coiled tighter around the sky, not descending further, not attacking, simply waiting. It did not press forward like a conqueror. It drifted, patient and immense, as though it already understood the outcome of this final moment. The people did not move. Their hands rested at their sides. Their faces, washed in soft bioluminescence, were calm. The eclipse had passed, but it had not lifted. It had become the air. The sovereign's fingers, still curled around the heir's hand, loosened with a tremble that betrayed how deep the surrender had truly cut. Though they stood upright, something inside had already folded. Their eyes remained on the creature kneeling before them, on the vast head lowered in something that resembled devotion. It did not blink, it did not breathe, but its silence was a presence, immense and constant, like the sea that waited for all rivers. The air turned their gaze upward. They await your final word. The sovereign did not answer immediately. For a long moment, they were still. Then they released the air's hand and stepped forward, slow and unsteady, until they stood before the creature. They reached out, not in challenge, not in command, but with the open palm of someone who had nothing left to lose. The air between them shimmered faintly. The creature's surface, once hard and chitinous, shifted beneath the sovereign's touch. It rippled, not in resistance, but in response. A pulse moved outward, invisible yet felt. A quiet tremor through the plaza stones and through every body gathered there. The people shivered and some wept, not from grief, but from release. The sovereign did not turn back to see them. They kept their hand against the creature's bowed brow, and as the silence deepened, they spoke. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but with the voice of someone who had ruled too long. I once believed I would never end, that by holding fast, by standing when others fell, I could shape the galaxy with my will alone. But time is not shaped. It is endured. And pride is not strength. It is loneliness made holy. The hum of the swarm responded, a low tone that resonated beneath the skin, not painful, but encompassing. It was not approval. It was not judgment. It was acknowledgement. The sovereign withdrew their hand. Their voice was quieter now. I do not know what I am without my burden, but I know what I became because of it, and I know what I cost. They turned at last, facing the gathered people, facing the air. You will remember me however you choose, as tyrant, as relic, as one who could not see the end when it came. They looked at the air with tired eyes. But I choose now, not for pride, not for power, only to give you what I never had. The air nodded, not as ruler to subject, but as witness to offering. They stepped forward, standing beside the sovereign, and the two of them raised their hands together. The swarm moved, not in violence, not in hunger, but in motion, like breath. A single creature, vast and slow, descended from above, its shape like a veil of stars, its limbs folding like wings. It passed over the plaza, casting no shadow, but instead a faint light, pale, silver, calm. Where it passed, the people began to kneel, not all at once, not commanded. It moved through them like water through sand, and they yielded without fear. And then something more subtle happened. The air grew warm, like dawn. The hum that filled the marrow softened, and the great creature at the heart of the swarm, the one who had knelt first, opened. It did not tear or shift with violence. It opened like a gate, like a cathedral door swinging inward, revealing a vast interior, not of flesh, but of memory. Shapes moved within, not forms, but feelings, echoes of lives, lost voices, songs sung by the dead. The sovereign stumbled back, their face pale with wonder, because within that impossible hollow they heard something they had long thought gone, the laughter of a friend, the whisper of a vow once made, the breath of a child against their shoulder. And then, without command, the people rose and began to walk toward the creature, toward the gate, some alone, some hand in hand, old men, mothers with infants, soldiers in broken armor. Their steps were slow, reverent, not toward death, toward absolution. The sovereign watched them go, and in watching they began to cry, not for loss, but for the breaking of silence, for the return of something they had not felt since before eternity took hold, forgiveness. The air stepped to their side. They are not being taken. They are being remembered. Every soul the swarm devours becomes part of something that does not forget. The sovereign's voice broke. Then I have been wrong about everything. The air took their arm. No, only about the end. This is not the end. It is the beginning you were never allowed. The sovereign looked up at the sky. The swarm no longer loomed. It lingered. The stars behind it were visible again, though softer, as if seen through mist. The creatures did not press forward. They did not hunt, they waited. And slowly the sovereign stepped toward the gate. The crowd parted. The air remained behind. The silence deepened, but it was no longer empty. It was full of echoes. At the threshold, the sovereign paused. Then, without grandeur, without ceremony, they stepped inside. The creature folded closed behind them, not sealing, not consuming, only enclosing. The air stood alone at the center of the plaza, their people, and watching. Above, the great swarm turned, not in retreat, but in orbit. The silence did not lift, but it changed. And across the throne world, for the first time in an age, there was peace. The palace was no longer a place of power. Its halls, once lit by banners and fire, now echoed with a softer quiet. The marble that had borne the footsteps of centuries now stood washed in silver light, drifting down through high windows where stars no longer flickered alone. The swarm hung above the world like a second sky, unmoving, unspeaking, present. It did not cast shadow, it cast remembrance. No more armies marched, no more orders echoed. The last echoes of the old empire had passed through the gate and been received. All that remained now was the shape of what came after. The heir stood at the center of the courtyard, no longer draped in ceremony or bloodline, no longer a child of thrones or prophecy. The people stood around them in a loose circle, not assembled for ritual, but simply present. They did not kneel, they did not cheer. There was no need. The act of being here was itself the answer. The air was still, thick with memory, and overhead, the great beasts of Morbidis turned in slow orbit, not as predators, but as moons. One of them pulsed faintly, as though exhaling through stone. The sovereign had not returned. No one asked if they would. No one demanded a body. The swarm did not leave remnants. It did not grant graves, but it gave memory. And in that memory, the sovereign had not ended. They had passed, become part of something wider than rule, wider than resistance. In their absence, they were more present than they had ever been. The heir closed their eyes. Their hand remained where it had been all night, outstretched toward the gate that no longer opened. They had stood there for hours, unmoving, listening, not to voices, but to the stillness between them. The murmur of the people behind them was not conversation, but breathing, the sound of a world remembering how to exist without command. They lowered their hand. The moment passed like breath. The gate did not open again. The great creature that had received the sovereign shifted once, then lifted slowly, rising into the air with the slow grace of an ascending cathedral. Its limbs folded beneath it. Its light dimmed, and it joined the others in the firmament, taking its place among the stars. The air turned to the people. There was no speech, no declaration. They simply stepped down from the marble dais and walked among them. One by one, they touched hands, met eyes, not as ruler, as equal, as one who had chosen not to seize power, but to release it. There would be no new empire, no crown, only presence. In the days that followed, the world changed, not with upheaval, but with absence. The systems of war that had once defined the planet faded into disuse. Barracks emptied, bastions were left unlocked. The great vaults of history opened, not to be guarded, but to be read. People moved freely through the palace, not as subjects, but as witnesses. No one destroyed what remained of the old regime. They did not need to. The old weight no longer held. The swarm remained above, vast and unmoving. It did not leave. It did not speak. But it stayed. The people came to call it the chorus. Not a fleet, not an enemy. A presence. Some stood beneath it and felt peace. Others wept, unsure why. Some began to dream of voices not their own, of faces they had never known but somehow remembered. No one claimed to understand it, but none rejected it. The air walked often among them. They offered no decrees, only guidance. Their voice, once so heavy with urgency, had softened. Now they asked questions more often than they answered them. What do you remember? What would you keep? What can we release? And slowly the people began to speak again, not in fear, not in command, but in curiosity. The palace garden bloomed. Its roots had not been tended in years, yet now the vines spread across old marble. The trees pressed upward through forgotten courtyards. Grass crept over the stone parade grounds where legions once assembled. Children played where officers once shouted, and no one told them to stop. One morning, the air sat beside the reflecting pool, where the sovereign once held court. The water was still, mirroring the sky above where the chorus drifted. They reached into the pool and touched the surface lightly. The ripples widened outward, their shape strange, circles folding over themselves, not breaking the reflection but multiplying it. The air did not recoil. They watched the movement until it settled again. Behind them, an elder approached, one who had once worn the robes of a court scholar. He held no title now. He carried no books, only memory. He sat beside the air in silence, and together they watched the sky. "Do you think they are at peace?" he asked at last, his voice low, reverent. The air did not answer immediately. They tilted their head back and closed their eyes. "I think they are not alone." The old man nodded slowly. That was always their fear. "I know," the air said. "It was mine too." They sat together as the sun passed behind the chorus. A soft light shimmered through the edges of the great living shapes. Somewhere beyond sight, the old world ended. But here, the new one continued. Quiet, strange, unburdened. Later that evening, a procession of lights began to rise. Small vessels, unarmed, unguarded, lifted from the surface and passed into the space between the chorus. Not to escape, not to flee, but to see. The air watched them rise and did not stop them. There was no border anymore, only continuation. And as night fell over the throne world, the people did not fear it. They gathered on rooftops and in open plazas, looking upward not with dread, but with wonder. For the first time in memory, the sky no longer threatened. It sang. The air stood alone once more at the center of the old courtyard. No banners flew, no anthem played. But the silence was not empty, it was full. Above, the chorus pulsed, not in warning, in recognition, and in that breathless stillness, in the aftermath of surrender and the breaking of empires, the last fragment of loneliness dissolved.